In this episode, do your shoulders need to be trained? Do you gotta work them? Do you? Huh?
The sun is shining, the birds are chirping, the bacon is sizzling. Welcome to the Daily Swole.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 237 of the Daily Mother Swole. Welcome to the Swolenormous podcast. You can catch it on SoundCloud and iTunes. Thanks for watching on YouTube. And also down below, if you're watching on YouTube, it's down below. You can't see them, but they can see you. Well, they can't see you. That'd be creepy. But they're live on Facebook every day at 12 noon Eastern Time at Swolenormous. So catch it live, catch it later on video, or listen on the podcast, SoundCloud, and iTunes. One of the best ways to catch the Daily Swole. Hopefully, if you're watching this show, you are repping your new Swolenormous shirt. If you haven't gotten it yet, you should be getting it real soon if you haven't already. But those things are shipping out, so stay tuned for the next line, the next round of Swolenormous gear. I'll be posting that up, and everyone can jump on that pony and ride. So it's going to be different, and I gotta get you guys styling. I can't have you in one shirt and, one freaking thing the whole time. We gotta give you some variety. Gotta give you some threads. You gotta have your gym shirt. Gotta have your going out shirt. If you want to be swole in the streets, you know what I'm saying? So what's up, everyone? Welcome. Premium members, welcome to everyone. This episode 237 is about shoulders. It's an exercise episode. We're talking about shoulders, deltoids. Do your shoulders need to be trained? Now, that being said, do your shoulders need to be trained? This is really, do your shoulders need to be isolated? I just figured, if I'm talking about isolated training, not a lot of people are going to be like, oh, that's really interesting. They might not know what isolated training means. So let's talk a little bit about the shoulders. Let's talk about the deltoid, and let's talk about that isolation concept and what that really means. So when we talk about training splits on this show, discussing training split means what you're doing on each day, whether you're doing chest on Monday, back on Tuesday, legs on Wednesday, that type of thing. And there's 100,000,001 ways to do a training split, rest on one day, yoga another. But now you know what a training split is. It pretty much means what you're doing on what day of your cycle before you rotate around, you do your body parts again, whatever it is. And it can rotate, it can change, it can alternate, it can stay the same for a few weeks or a few months. Depends on the program, what your goals are. So do shoulders need to be isolated? Do they need to be trained and targeted directly? Do you need to do overhead presses, side raises, rear deltoid work? Do you need to do it? And if so, when should you do it? And if not, why? So there are three parts of the deltoid. Let's break down the shoulder a little bit. You have three parts of the muscle. And you have the anterior, the side portion, which is the lateral or the medial head. And you also have the posterior deltoid. So you have three parts of this shoulder muscle. You also have a series of muscles underneath the shoulder, underneath the superficial tissue, deep inside, called the rotator cuff. Now, you might have heard people injuring the rotator cuff. You might not know what that actually is. I've heard people even say that they thought the rotator cuff was a muscle. It's actually four muscles that come at the shoulder from different angles that kind of create a little cuff. So this is the head of the humerus, the shoulder bone. They kind of come around from different sides, a couple from the side, one from the front, and one from the top, and they just grab the head of the humerus. They grab the shoulder bone, Jesus Christ. They grab the humerus, the upper arm bone, from different angles to keep it in close proximity to the shoulder joint, where the scapula and the clavicle interact. So you have pretty much balance muscles. You have stabilizing muscles. You have those muscles deep, the rotator cuff, that keep the arm in place. Then you have the deltoid, the shoulder muscles on top, that create the ability of the body to produce force. So the deltoid, what we're talking about, when you're looking at me and you see these massive fucking cannonballs sticking out the side, that is the deltoid. You're seeing the three parts of the deltoid, the superficial, closer to the surface. You're seeing the muscles that are on the outside. Okay, so that's what you see when you look at someone. You don't look like, hey, that guy's got a hell of an infraspinatus. Man, look at that subscapularis. That's boss. You don't see those separations in the average person. And professional bodybuilders, you can see some detail. But you're not seeing that when you look at someone, especially in a shirt. When you see shape and the aesthetic appearance, then you're seeing the deltoid. You're not seeing the rotator cuff. I mean, I never looked at a guy and be like, man, that infraspinatus is absolutely yoked. No one said that. It said no one ever, unless you're on the Mr. Olympia stage. But they're very important. They're very important. The infraspinatus, the supraspinatus, the teres minor, and the subscapularis, those 4 muscles of the rotator cuff are super important for keeping you healthy. When you tear a muscle, you're not injuring your deltoid. When you hurt your shoulder, you're not injuring your pec. Sometimes it's your biceps tendon, but usually it's your rotator cuff muscle. And the reason is because those muscles are undertrained, and then you go for strength on top of it. And when you're going for strength and you're trying to do overhead presses or bench presses, you hurt your rotator cuff and your shoulder because the muscles that are stabilizing aren't stabilizing. So you're putting force and pressure on a joint that doesn't have stability, and then you have pops, tears, injuries, pain, nagging pain, inflammation, and you keep on going and adjusting. Eventually, you have to get surgery or you have to rest a long time. If you've had shoulder pain, chances are you've tweaked and you've poked around that area. I promise you, if you've had shoulder pain, it's been your rotator cuff to some extent. And it's normal, unfortunately, when you put your body under duress. Even if you do everything properly, you're always risking yourself. When you're working out in the gym, when you're lifting heavy weights, you're always risking injury. Don't think that it's abnormal to get hurt or to get tweaked in the gym. Man, you're putting focused pressure 5-6 days a week for years on end. If you have a little tweak, man, you're lucky. I mean, you're not breaking bones. It's not a car accident. But if you do things the right way, you can minimize your risk dramatically. But there's always a risk, right? There's a risk walking down the stairs that you're going to trip and fall. No jinx. I hope no one falls today. Don't blame it on me. That's the waiver right there. If you fall today, not my fault. It ain't Papa Swolenormous' fault. I swear. So let's go back to the shoulder. When you train your shoulders, the shoulders are getting hit during all upper body activity. When you do a bench press, when you do a push-up, when you do a pull-up, when you do a row, you're always hitting the shoulder. Yeah? You're always hitting the shoulder. You're hitting the front, you're hitting the side, you're hitting the rotator cuff because they're stabilizing. You might not be isolating the rotator cuff. You might not be doing rotator cuff strengthening exercises, but the rotator cuff is working. The deltoids are working. If you're doing a pulling motion, even the front's working. It's stabilizing the shoulder. It's still holding on to the head of the humerus. So these muscles are always engaged and always involved, no matter what the exercise, whether they're getting strengthened specifically and they're getting improved for future exercise. You know, that's going to really happen when you're doing like your external rotations and your isolated movements specifically for the rotator cuff. But anytime you do upper body work, they're always working, they're stabilizing, they're participating, which is why they get hurt in the first place, because they are there and they're working. In general, the front of the shoulder is overworked and the back is underworked. And part of this is because bench pressing and pushing movements is just more popular, because when you're looking in the mirror, you only see the front. And over the years, we talk about, let's say bodybuilder syndrome, people walking around all internally rotated and puffing their chest out like a rooster. People like to work their chest. They like to work their abs. They like to work the beach muscles that you can see. So when you look at someone, you're looking at the front of them. When you're looking in the mirror, you're looking at the front of yourself. Not a lot of times do you turn your head around like an owl and look at the back of your shoulder and look at your lats and analyze that. If you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to be impressive from all different angles, that's why I like bodybuilding, because you develop everything evenly. And when you develop things aesthetically, a lot of times it helps balance everything out physically and neurologically, because you are training all sides of the joint. You're creating that even pressure, that even pull, that balance. So that's super important. So the front is usually overtrained. The back is usually undertrained. And you can correct that by doing corrective exercises. You could correct that by doing your external rotations, your floor cobras like we talk about in premium. When we talk about these corrective exercises in premium, doing the floor cobras, doing your external rotation exercises, those of you that are in Swolenormous premium, we've talked about this. We've talked about how to correct upper cross syndrome, how to correct that fruit roll-up internally rotated look. And that can cause a lot of shoulder problems, and that can affect your overall muscle growth. Not to mention, it'll affect your strength, but it'll affect your health and bottom line, you don't want pain, right? You don't want any shoulder injuries, because an injury is going to keep you out of the gym. And that's one of the biggest things I always talk about. If you're hurt, you can't train. If you can't train, you lose gains. And we don't want that. So rotator cuff imbalances are a huge component of the shoulders. And I'm getting to whether or not they should be isolated and trained in a moment. Just giving you a little background, the rotator cuff imbalances will lead to other types of imbalances, will lead to the anterior continuing to be worked. You're in a car, you're on a desk, you're at a desk all day long, then you're crushing the front of the shoulders, doing a lot of bench pressing. You're not isolating the posterior deltoid well. You're still shrugging your shoulders and hitting the upper trapezius, because you're still just neurally firing those upper traps when you're trying to do your lower traps, when you're trying to do your rhomboids, when you're trying to do your lats, you're still hitting the upper traps because of form imbalances, because of those muscle imbalances. It is a cycle. I promise you, it is a cycle. The deeper you get into this cycle, the deeper you get into it, the more you get stuck. It's that vicious cycle. You start working your anterior deltoid and you hit your upper traps too much because your lower and middle traps aren't firing. Your posterior deltoid gets weaker. So then every subsequent exercise, you keep on hitting those overactive muscles more and more and more. And eventually you're going to get hurt, you're going to have chronic pain, and you're going to have to back off, and then you won't know why. You have to create these habits properly from the beginning. Shoulders give you an aesthetic appeal. Most of us want wider shoulders, smaller waist. One of the greatest ways to give someone that visual look of being in shape and having a great physique is not only a smaller waist, but genetically, some people have wider or smaller waists just by nature, is to create wider shoulders. Wider shoulders will give you a smaller waist in proportion. When you're looking at someone, oh, they have wider shoulders. By effect, it makes the waist look smaller. So from a bodybuilding, from a physique standpoint, most of the top trainers will focus all of their exercise for the upper body. They will focus them around the shoulders, making sure the shoulders get hit, the shoulders get carved, and then aesthetically, you will look more shapely. You'll have more of that V taper, and the V taper just means the width of the shoulders to the waist. It looks like a V, and that V taper makes someone look powerful. Wider shoulders, smaller waist. You can get a visually smaller waist by making the shoulders look bigger, and then in comparison, the waist looks smaller. So tiny waist, dieting, and also bigger shoulders with mass. So let's think about this. What muscles are actually most important? What part of the shoulder is most important? Well, by what I just said, giving you the thickness and the density, the posterior deltoid and the medial head of the deltoid, the side, lateral raises, and posterior rotator cuff and deltoid work. That's where I focus most of my energy on. When I train, I focus on the side and the rear of my shoulders. I don't do a lot of front. I add them in there on occasion, but they get hit a lot with proper chest work. Doing your bench pressing, doing your pressing movements, and just from everything you do during the day, the anterior deltoid generally gets overworked. So I dramatically overload the side and the rear. And a lot of people think that I've taken substances because of the way my posterior deltoid works. It gets pointy, it juts out, and it looks very pumped and full. Same thing when I do side deltoid work. I have a huge cap on the side of my shoulders because for years, 5, 10, 15 years of my training has been largely side and lateral work. I have always crushed the posterior and the medial head of the shoulder. And that's why I have great shoulder development, because I have biased all my training in the past to the side and the rear. Now, why would you want to train shoulders and why would you not want to train shoulders? Well, first off, like I said, the shoulders get worked during any upper body exercise. When you are training for a sport, be it bodybuilding or a athletic sport, that can have application for shoulder training. You should always, everyone across the board should be doing shoulder stabilization work. This can come in the form of yoga, which we've talked about at length, and we will continue to talk about yoga all the time because it's super important. Yoga is fantastic for shoulder stabilization. Doing isolated rotator cuff work is phenomenal for shoulder stabilization. When you do any of that isolated rotator cuff work, you do it with very light weight, a very long, drawn-out eccentric contraction, and you do high repetitions because that's what gets the slow twitch fibers in the rotator cuff. Doing fast, explosive movements with heavy weight, that's going to hit more of the deltoid and leave the rotator cuff wanting. And the problem with that is that overload is going to stress the rotator cuff, but the rotator cuff doesn't get fired, doesn't get trained. So then the rotator cuff is at risk for injury, and that's why people hurt themselves doing bench pressing and doing heavy shoulder presses and things of that sort, because their rotator cuff is too weak to handle the load and the speed of the reps, and you get injured. When you say shoulder, people are like, oh, I hurt my shoulder. It's very rarely the deltoid, and it's rarely the biceps, it's rarely the lats, and it's rarely the pectoralis. It's the rotator cuff. And if you've hurt your shoulder before, chances are it's been the rotator cuff. And that's unfortunate. It's preventable to an extent. Of course, if you hurt yourself, you hurt yourself. But the rotator cuff can be trained well enough to greatly and vastly reduce the risk of that kind of overuse injury, because if there's proper balance, there's less rubbing, there's less friction, there's less imbalance and less risk of any kind of tears or micro tears or inflammation that can limit all your other sorts of movements that will benefit you greatly during your training. You don't want to be injured. You don't want to be set back. Functional for sport, aesthetic appeal, bodybuilding. Now, a lot of you that might be looking to lose weight now, you're thinking like, man, I want aesthetic appeal. I want to look better. Well, if you're a beginner or intermediate, in a lot of cases, you do not need to isolate your shoulders. You should still do your rotator cuff work. You should still do your stabilization work, but to go heavy on shoulder presses, to go heavy on front raises, things like that, you don't need to. If you're a beginner, if you are looking to lose a lot of weight, you need to stick to macro movements. Focus on the pressing movements like the bench press, incline, flies, flat, whatever it is. Focus on the rows, pull-ups, focus on doing any kind of, back flies, isolated back movements. Work on your rotator cuff movements, work on your external rotations and things of that sort, your ball cobras, do your yoga. But you don't necessarily, especially at a beginner level, you do not need to isolate the shoulders because they get worked so hard during the pressing movements like chest and the pulling movements like back. Once you're more intermediate, more advanced, and you're looking to carve more shape, you're looking for specific results, then you could start applying that. But all too often, you have beginners starting with these workout programs that overload and isolate shoulder exercises, and it can actually be a detriment to their program. And here's why. When you're a beginner, you have weak muscles everywhere in comparison to someone who's more advanced. You start training shoulders and you don't do your rotator cuff and your stabilization exercises. People are going to the gym doing side raises with improper form, rear raises maybe with improper form, and then they're overloading the anterior deltoid with front raises, bench pressing, and shoulder pressing. As a result, you are overloading muscles that are weak, and you're still leaving behind a rotator cuff that's already inherently weak because you've never trained muscles too much before in your life. So you're overloading a lot. You're not ready for the volume on those isolated muscles like the shoulder because they get worked so much already. So you're putting so much overload at the beginning on muscles that are already getting a lot of overload. So they've never had overload, and now they're getting, not to mention chest exercises, back exercises, bicep and tricep exercise, and then you're getting shoulder again. So you're hitting them 3 or 4 times a week easily. Not to mention when you're holding weights for legs or you're holding the bar for legs, you're just putting your shoulders under a lot of stress. And even if you're adding yoga into the program, you might be working your shoulders, very intensely 4, 5, 6 days a week. And that can be overloading and you can get an overuse injury. It's great to add yoga to your program. I always say that. I encourage it. It's great to isolate shoulders, but at the beginning, even if you do everything properly, it's still going to be too much. You have to ease into it. You have to get your feet wet. So avoid isolating shoulders until you have a strong base, and then implement isolated shoulder work slowly and consistently. I am an advanced trainer. I do not isolate shoulders all the time. If I do, it's largely the side and the rear, and I do that on other days when I'm doing my chest or back or when I'm doing my arm training. It depends on the week, depends on how much time I have for my personal program. But even myself, I don't always do isolated shoulder day anymore. And that's just because I feel like I can get just as much done for what I need to do, keep my shoulders safe, and I'd rather work more on stabilization and crush the heavier weights when I do chest, when I do back, and not necessarily spread out my training so much where I leave a whole entire day isolated just for shoulders. I'm not stepping on stage. I don't have a great imbalance with my shoulders, but I add in shoulder-centric workouts on my chest and back days. So I'm still doing chest, but I am focusing a lot on shoulders as well. If I hit my triceps as well, I focus a lot on either posterior deltoid on chest day, believe it or not, to balance it out. And because when you do triceps, you're also hitting a little bit posterior deltoid in certain exercises, and it's a great combination. And on back day, I'll do either rear again or side raise. Because at my level, the smaller muscles of the posterior deltoid and the lateral and the medial head of the deltoid are smaller muscles. They generally recover quicker. And with my level and with my yoga work, I know when my shoulders need isolated training or when they need a little bit extra push. So be careful isolating your shoulder at the beginning if you're a newbie to training. You don't need to isolate shoulder training. If you're new, you need to focus on macro movements, focus on form. Don't overload muscles that you might think, I have to upgrade, I need to push, I need to put a lot of stress on my shoulder. Not really the case. Not really the case when you're new because your shoulders are fresh. They're fresh to everything, and they're getting a lot of stimulus. They're getting a lot of overload when you do pushing movements and when you do pulling movements, especially for adding things in like yoga. And you can easily overload and cause an overuse injury early in your training rather than letting yourself build up over time and then start isolating more. I think a lot of people try to train like bodybuilders too soon. Not that's a bad thing. You're motivated. You want to get results now. The problem is you won't get results now. It will take you years, and you need to be patient. Otherwise, you're going to get those overuse injuries like tendonitis and inflammation, and then it's going to set you back. So there's always another day. Build up slowly. Don't overload isolated body parts, especially if you're new to training. And if you do start isolating or you want to add something, if you're a beginner, leave the shoulders alone. Don't train them all alone on their separate day, but focus more on rotator cuff work, stabilization, and add yoga to your program to bring up your shoulders and your stabilization work. Trust me, flexibility in the shoulders is everything. Stabilization training with your shoulders is everything to keep you healthy. And this is the type of stuff that no one's going to tell you. They want to push you onto a short-term, quick fix weight loss program, and they'll have you doing all crazy kinds of macro movements and hard work to get you to lose weight. But guess what? You lose 10, 15 pounds, that's fine. It doesn't set you up for the rest of your life, and it sets you up for possibly compensations and a shoulder injury down the road and not too far, mind you. So when you're doing these programs or these weight loss programs or these transformation things, make sure they have your best interest in mind and you understand going in that it's not necessarily going to take into account your compensations, your imbalances that could lead to an injury and then set you back to where you started before you even started the program. So you might lose 10, 15 pounds, but then, hey, your shoulder hurts or you tore something. How are you going to be in another 3 or 4 months when you haven't been working out because your shoulder hurts? That weight's going to come back and maybe even more. So make sure you set yourself up for success, especially going into this new year. Make sure you pay attention to your body and focus on the stabilization. Don't worry about isolation, especially if you're looking to lose weight and see a lot of change and you're new to fitness. If you're more intermediate and advanced, then you can start working on the side and the lateral. Just do me a favor, and for a while, just forget about the front of your shoulder. Do your chest, do your back, do the side and lateral, focus on rotator cuff, the external rotations. Don't even worry about the anterior deltoid. I guarantee your physique is going to look better, you're going to feel better, and you're not going to be as sore and overloaded in your shoulder if you have those problems already, and you're not going to miss it, I promise you. Thank you so much for joining me for episode 237 of The Daily Mother Swole. Flex for Facebook, got to move over for the frame. YouTube, I'm just kind of dancing around, doing that little flexosaurus. Thank you so much for sharing this broadcast every day. Every fucking day. The year is almost over. Every day for the Daily Swole on the Swolenormous podcast at 2:37. Tomorrow's going to be 2:38, of course, at 12 noon Eastern time. Make sure you share this broadcast with anyone that needs to see this-ish online. You can share it on Facebook, of course, Facebook Live at Swolenormous, and also check me out on Instagram on the Snappy Chats. And of course, you can catch us on YouTube and listen on SoundCloud and iTunes at Swolenormous. Swolenormous Podcast, Daily Swole, episode 237 in the books. I'll see y'all tomorrow. Premium members, stay tuned for a broadcast right after this. Going to go live in a couple moments to wrap up some stuff on the shoulder. If you're interested in signing up for Swolenormous Premium, my private Facebook exclusive awesome badass group, you can click the sign up button on my Facebook page or go to swolenormous.com to sign up, because you are going to get advanced techniques, training, and immediate feedback, private training, group training, accountability. It's going to be badass. Today's episode, I really want to dig a little bit more into the shoulder and those corrective exercises, so we're going to do that now. I'll see some of you there that are watching that are in premium right now, and I'll see everyone else tomorrow at 12 noon Eastern time. Peace out. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Stay away from the shoulders if you're a noob. If you're not, crush that shit. Peace.